Chapter 1. Haley Stafford had a lot of determination, and what she felt was a good dose of self-confidence. She stared into the mirror in her new suit, turning left and right, testing out her smile and her handshake. Opportunities like this didn't come around for everyone, and she wasn't going to let this one go to waste. Triathlon Industries was a corporate giant, with products all over the market. One of their specialties was pharmaceuticals, and it was with this branch that Haley had scored an interview. She was a chemist, and formulating pills to be popped had been a dream of hers since her college years, when she herself was popping just about anything that came across her way. Turned out she had been smart regardless of her adventurous spirit, and her Bachelor of Science and specialization in chemistry had not proven too much for her to handle. Her marks were mostly B's with the occasional A or C+. All in all, a very good student who turned out to be a competent chemist. And though her work record wasn't long as she was still young, she didn't feel too overwhelmed going in. Or she would once she got out of her apartment and down to the branch's headquarters on 5th and Main. Calling a cab did no good in a city as big as LA. After a little hailing, though, she found her ride. She was early anyway. She'd rather take no chances. The ride was a little slow going, but that was no sweat off her back. 20 minutes before her appointed interview time at 4:45 p.m., she was standing before the doors to what she hoped would be the new place of employment. She took a deep breath and went inside. There was a female receptionist who took her name and asked her to take the elevator to the 11th floor where she would be directed further. As she expected, there was a mild-looking man with puddle-brown hair and eyes waiting for her as the door opened after the elevator had taken her up. "Miss Stafford?" "Yes, that's me." "Very good. My name is Gregory. Your interview is with Mr. Crawley, if you'll follow me." He turned and she followed. They went through a small maze of hallways before arriving at a small sitting area. At the end of the room was an old-style wooden door of some kind. Haley didn't know her wood, so she couldn't say what it was made of, but it was dark and reddish. Gregory turned back to her, and for a moment it was as if his eyes were different somehow. She looked again, but no, they were brown. She must have been seeing things. He smiled. "If you'll please sit here, Mr. Crawley will see you at 5 p.m. 5? What happened to 4:45? Haley guessed that they must have just wanted her to show up on time. She thought this guy was a little weird. "Oh, okay. Thank you." "Of course." He silently walked away down the hall, turning the corner left at the end of it. She sat and checked her phone. 4:35. The ideal time for a cell phone game, but she'd never been into video games of any kind. She didn't have a book to read either, so she just settled in to wait. Checking her watch a few times over the ensuing minutes, she was now looking at it as it said 4:59. It turned over to 5, and seconds later a man emerged from behind the wooden door. He was tall, at least a little over 6 feet, and he looked older, but it was hard to say how much older. 50s, maybe? Late 40s? He had no gray in his black hair. She stood up to meet him, extending her hand. "Haley Stafford." He took her hand in his, and then oddly put his other hand over to the top of hers in a small caress. "Robert Crawley," he said with a smile, his bright brown eyes striking. "Please, come into my office, Miss Stafford." He leaned back and then waved his arm towards the wooden door he had just emerged from. Haley felt uncomfortable for some reason, but she figured it was just that gross handshake. He might be a perv, so what? She didn't think she was about to be raped or anything, as this was an official situation. She went into the office. He came in behind her and walked past her, moving to the chair behind his desk. He sat down. There was a turned-out chair on the other side of the desk, of inferior quality to the cushy one he himself sat in. He motioned to it. "Sit, if you will, Miss Stafford." She took a seat, smiling. Already feeling better about her momentary case of the heebie-jeebies, she now felt she had to comment on the office. It had a very cool, very gothic look. "This is a very nice office you have here, Mr. Crawley. Is this desk made of the same wood as the door?" "Why, yes, it is, Miss Stafford. But we're not here to discuss interior decoration. We're here to discuss you." A smile spread across his lips. "You smell simply amazing, Haley." The discomfort was back, times 10. There was something up with this guy. Her internal alarms were sounding. "I thought this was an interview." I don't see what me smelling like has to do with anything. I conduct all of my interviews at 3 p.m., every day that I have them. 5 p.m. is dinner time. Suddenly there was a transformation in his face. His brown eyes shifted somehow and became red, and his smile turned into a grin full of wickedly pointed teeth. Haley sat there with her mouth open in shock. She had seen vampires in the news and on television, but they were rare, and most people never had to meet one. "You're a vampire." She was in shock. She couldn't believe this was happening. She knew the proper name to use was Ambrogae, but she couldn't think. He laughed. "And your dinner." She screamed that. It did her no good. "Damn it, Seike! Damn it! Do you know the repercussions that will occur now that you have done this?" Elder Kessel paced the room, stepping over books scattered around. This old library was the place the elder called home. He was muttering in the ancient tongue now, which Seike hadn't bothered learning much of in nearly a century of being an Ambrosius, or vampire. He didn't care for either name, really. The elder abruptly turned from his mutterings, locking eyes with him. "We of Selene already have a tenuous enough relationship with the human world. What you did won't become public knowledge. Instead, only the human elite will be informed, which is far worse." Up until now, Seike had just let the elder tirade over him while remaining silent. He was honor-bound to report to Kessel whenever he had dealings with the human world beyond passing through it. The elder was the father of his late sire. Those of the blue eyes could sometimes procreate naturally. Though it was a small chance of happening in general, it was still very hard when trying to conceive. He always tried to speak with care towards the elder, and did so now. "I admit it didn't go nearly as smoothly as I planned. I was aiming for 0 casualties." "You shouldn't have been there. S-47 is no joke, and they only tolerate those with the blue eyes because of our connections throughout the rest of the human world. We wouldn't need to give them much reason to change their minds about that tolerance. Not to sound brazen, Elder, but I believe the color of my eyes curbs blame being laid at the feet of the people of Selene." The elder scoffed at him. "Though you're not really known in the human world, there are those who do know of you, and they have come to associate you with my kind. They know you follow our rules at any rate. Or at least did." "I still do." Kessel hesitated. Seike was sincere in his words. The elder read it in his eyes. Plenty of Selene's brood were hot-headed while still young, and it would seem he of the violet eyes followed that same trend. Not for the first time, though, the elder wondered about Seike's proclivity towards the whisperings of the Leviathan. It was an old worry from an old worrywart. "She wouldn't have wanted this, young man. You must know this is not what she would have wanted," Elder Kessel stated after the brief hesitation. Seike visibly flinched at those words, and Kessel could see he had wounded him in saying them. It made them no less the truth, however. The look of pain in those strange eyes at first made the elder regret that he hadn't chosen his words more carefully. It didn't take long for Seike to ball his hands in a fist, though, anger radiating from eyes that were now glaring at the elder. "That's not fair. I couldn't stand living anymore knowing that sadistic son of a bitch was still alive out there. It was only by chance that I found his location at all, and once I determined where he was being held, I tried going the diplomatic route first. I really did, Elder. They didn't want to talk. They were too afraid for talk." Seike's hands kept clenching and unclenching, his anger wavering between rage and sadness. The boy was right, Kessel concluded. It wasn't a fair thing he had said. The elder let out a long and sad sigh and propped his bottom down on a stack of books. He investigated Seike's eyes. They weren't so angry now. The sadness he knew that the young Ambrosius was experiencing had proven to be a balancing point of sorts. Perhaps there was no need to regret the stinging words he had just used, but there was a need for an apology. "I am sorry, Seike. I spoke out of my heart, without using my head. Truly, I am glad that Emilio is dead. I loved her too, you know." The last words came out as a hoarse whisper. For long moments, the two men just stood there, looking at each other, remembering Celinda. They both felt one another's sadness as something real and tangible, not in a simply empathetic way, but in a truly empathic fashion. There would be no more arguing over what was already done, the elder knew. It was time to move on in the discussion. Time to decide what would be done in the future as a result of past actions. "The council is going to want to mete out some form of punishment for me," Seike stated. It was not a question in his mind. The elder sighed again, this time exasperated. He shifted his position on the books to rest his chin on the palm of one hand. His blue eyes were thoughtful, and Seike wondered again just how old the elder truly was. His hair was almost completely white, and that was saying a lot for any of the Ambrogae. When an older human was turned, despite whether they ended up being of the Leviathan or of the Serpent, they regained a good portion of their youthful appearance. A man in his 70s was once turned into a vampire, and he looked like he was 30 again after the transformation had completed. He ended up being a red, though. Seike had dispatched him personally during his feeding frenzy. The feeding frenzy was a pseudo-ritual that every newly made Ambrogae who ended up siding with the Leviathan went through. Legion would tighten its grip on their mind by getting them to kill and feed from as many humans as possible once their eyes went red, for a period of one full day. There was some kind of ranking system involved, Seike knew. It was more than just bragging rights. The more humans that were killed, the greater the measure of respect that was offered to the new vampire among his brethren. Those of Legion had their own form of telepathy amongst themselves, and though they could not readily read the minds of humans, they had various forms of mental coercion and mind control that they could utilize on their victims. Just when Seike was about to say more, Kessel spoke up. "I can handle the council. I stand at their head, after all." A sly smile crept onto the old man's face. Seike wanted to grin just from seeing that expression, but he was still worried. Too often, the council had been made to overlook certain transgressions of his because he stood apart from the two known factions of the Ambrogae, and yet he fully sided with the Blues. Despite the uniqueness of his eyes, he had proven to them over time that he had indeed kept his humanity, which to them meant that he was a Blue for all intents and purposes. And like many young Ambrogae of Selene, he was prone to making mistakes that required intercession. Up until this point, though, he had never killed any humans. This was a much more serious offense compared to any of his earlier insubordinations, even if the deaths were accidental. Despite what Elder Kessel perhaps believed, there would be consequences for Seike. He might even be banished from the harbors of the safe havens. "I will accept whatever punishment is bestowed upon me, Elder," Seike said calmly. All that remained now was to face whatever was to come with all the dignity and poise that he could muster. In the weeks following Celinda's death, he had been suicidal. He had deprived himself of blood and was likely near fatal starvation when Kessel had some choice words with him that changed the course of his life and gave him the courage to keep on living. Those words were similar in content to what he had just said about what she wouldn't have wanted, but instead they were what she would have wanted. She would have wanted him to keep on living, and so he did. It didn't take very long, however, for his thoughts back then to turn toward the cold hate that he had borne until the moment that he had ripped that bastard's heart out. He had been consumed with the idea of revenge for the better part of the last 2 decades. It had driven him. Now he felt hollowed out again. Not suicidal, but lost. The Ambrogae of Selene were not telepathic with one another in the sense that they could read each other's minds like they could read human minds. However, they had deep empathic connections that could give each other very good ideas about whatever they might be thinking about. The connection between the Blues was so strong that they could feel the presence of their own kind a mile or more away. They could sense those of Legion in a similar manner, though not at quite that distance. Perhaps close to a mile, but not beyond. That was how he had stumbled upon Emilio's location. He had felt the old creature nearly a mile below his feet while on a sojourn through the Minnesotan forest. Unlike a typical Blue, Seike was able to discern identities through the telltale psychic signature of another Ambrosius or Ambrogess, as long as he had met the individual at some point face to face. He would accept whatever the punishment would be, and he would continue on with the kind of life that was considered normal for a good-natured vampire. Stopping reds, feeding from blood bags, and the occasional sleeping human. At least that was assuming he wasn't to be banished from the few places of safety for Blues around the country. If that were to happen, his life would most definitely change course in comparison to what it had been like for nearly a century now. Elder Kessel may as well have been reading his mind at that moment. "I know you believe you are going to be banished, my friend," the old one intoned. "Do not think for a moment that I am going to allow that to happen. Other Blues have on occasion killed humans either in self-defense or through some accidental means, and they are rarely banished for it." "I just have this feeling," Seike responded. "You know Jirai doesn't like me. He's never fully trusted in my humanity. Varana has always seemed to disdain me as well. That last part came out sarcastically. Heaving his own sigh, the young Ambrosius found a spot on the floor devoid of the clutter of books and plopped himself down, resting his hands on his knees. It is my opinion that this entire endeavor of yours has only proven you to be more human. For what could be more human than to be driven by the pain of losing someone dear to you? Driven by it to the point where you do something reckless and regretful. The elder stood up then, placing his hands behind his back. Then he cleared his throat and began a slow pacing as he spoke. He was my brother. He was not an Ambrosius, no. He was human. I myself had only been turned for a mere handful of years when it happened. I was still trying to keep my human life, you see. My parents had passed away many years before I became an Ambrosius, as had their siblings, all of whom had not had any children. Only my brother and I remained in our entire family as far as I knew. In my human life, I had rather piercing blue eyes. At the time, I thought it was good fortune that I did, for I was able to maintain a relationship with my brother, who only noted at times that my eyes seemed somewhat bluer than usual, but otherwise was none the wiser, nor suspicious at all. Now, thinking back on it, I believe it would have been better had I not been able to disguise my nature, and simply stayed away from him. The elder was clearly struggling to keep his composure now. How much pain this old man must have gone throughout who knew how many centuries of existence. Seike had never really given it much thought before, but he did now. Kessel continued. This is something I try not to think about, much less talk of with anyone. My sire was a red. Actually, Kessel's eyes met Seike's, his gaze sharpening. My sire was Emilio. Seike knew it was coming before the name had been stated. Even so, his heart sped up to the point where his vision slightly blurred for a moment before going into a crystal-clear focus. He had never guessed, and no one had told him in nearly 100 years of being what he now was. Emilio was a figure that all those of Selene were educated on early into their new lives. Had Celinda known that he was the sire of her father? More questions bubbled to the surface of his mind, but he forced himself to empty his head and slow down his heart. Kessel had noticed Seike's reaction to this information and was regarding him with a strange expression, head tilted slightly. Once Seike could meet the elder's eyes again, the old one gave a small, almost apologetic shrug. Then it dawned on him. There was no way he was going to be banished for putting Emilio to the final death, even if 2 human lives were lost in the process. As if Kessel had been reading his mind yet again, the elder chose that moment to allow himself a small smile. Seike, you and I, and many, many others, did not want that horrible old monster to continue living. That includes most of the council. He killed my brother, though I blame myself that it happened. But that's a story for some other time. Emilio was responsible for a great deal of pain caused among those of Selene throughout most of North America and Europe over the centuries. Suddenly Seike felt another presence enter the library. A voice he had come to dislike spoke from the archway separating the library's 2 main chambers. That being said, you will still have to serve some sort of penance, and we will soon be discussing just what that will be. Through the archway strode Jirai. He wore a frown, as he always did whenever he was in proximity to Seike. His black hair was generously streaked with silver, indicating numerous centuries of life as an Ambrosius. And where there was Jirai... There you are, Kessel. Varana walked silently through the arch to stand beside her husband. She pursed her full lips in disapproval as she looked at Seike. Preparing this one for his inevitable punishment, I hope. Perhaps some lashings and a few years in service to the nobility will cool his head. A few years in service to her is what she meant, like the dog she saw him to be. Elder Kessel gave a quiet chuckle, meeting Seike's eyes briefly before striding up to the 2 newcomers. That look said for him to keep his tongue from spitting venom, as he had been known to do from time to time with Varana. He could hold his peace around Jirai, as the councilman was honest as a person, as far as Seike could tell, and despite not liking the violet-eyed one, he spared him from unnecessary insult. Piranha, on the other hand, liked to verbally abuse Seike. She wasn't on the council, so sometimes he would insult her in retaliation. To do so on this day would be unwise, however. He knew that. He picked himself up off the floor, though. He'd be damned if he was gonna just sit there and let that bitch look down on him literally as well. I assume the council will be convening soon, Kissel said, bringing both of the other two Ambrogae's stairs towards him. Yes, in 1 hour, Jirai stated. His tone was rather detached, as it usually was. He seemed cold at times, but mostly it was simply that he didn't allow his emotions to get the better of him, no matter the situation. Come, my dear, let us go and inform the others. Firenna gave one last callous look towards Seike before turning on her heel and following her husband out of the library. Jirai was second only to Elder Kessel on the Central Council, which operated out of this haven that they all called home. The haven was called the Central Haven and was located in Iowa. His rank called for the gathering of council members for meetings whenever the elder was otherwise occupied. Kessel must have informed of his intentions to meet and speak with Seike before the young Ambrogius had arrived back at the haven. They would all have sensed him coming. According to Kessel, Seike's presence felt a little different from other blues, but was otherwise still quite pleasant when compared to someone of Legion. Seike did not doubt that the difference in feeling had been a cause for many to distrust him, as much as his eyes were. The elder watched them go, waiting a few moments after they silently closed the library doors behind them, before turning back to Seike. She's afraid of you, you know. She masks the fear well, but she's always been afraid of you. That's why she treats you as she does. Kessel's eyes held sympathy for him, but Seike didn't want sympathy. He didn't really mind being mostly a loner, with few friends among the Ambrogae of Selene, and nothing but enemies among the Reds. Unlike the Blues, he had the ability to turn his eyes, for a time, back to their original color. In this case, that was brown. That was a trait of those of the Leviathan. They could also change their eyes back to whatever color they had been as ordinary humans, or in the case of a pure-blood Ambrogae, who were all of Legion and born as offspring, they could disguise their eyes whatever normal human color they saw fit to. Many Blues didn't like that trait of his, but it suited him just fine. It made it easy for him to move about the human world without attracting notice, and if he ever got lonely, he found walking among humans to be pretty therapeutic. He had even managed to befriend a couple of humans in the last decade, though it wouldn't be much longer now before they noticed he wasn't aging. Jackson Houston and Fergus Harrelson were drinking buddies he had met in Iowa City about 7 years ago. They had gone to college together and didn't take life too seriously. Both of them had worked near the city, but nothing that had anything to do with their Bachelor of Arts. They were both in construction, different outfits. They loved to joke about how they were each other's competition in both work and social life. They even made sport out of competing for the same women at times. They were a couple of ordinary fellas that helped Seike feel both ordinary and not so lonely. The former feeling was, of course, an illusion, but the dissipation of loneliness, that was genuine. It was easy to have a good time with those boys. They were both nearly into their 30s now, and both still retained the youthful appearance of their college days. Ferg attributed that to the dope, as he called it, marijuana. They both liked their joints, and Seike didn't mind smoking and drinking with them, even though alcohol and weed had no effect on him whatsoever. That was actually how he got to know them. He drank them both under the table the night that he had met them, to their high praise later on. Firenna has no reason to be afraid of me after all this time. The elder drew his bushy brows together as he frowned. Whether you mind it or not, you're an anomaly, Seike. There isn't any lore on you or in any kind of purple-eyed Ambrosius or Ambrogess. No one has anything to go on. Add that to the fact that you're as powerful as a 1,000-year-old when you are in fact barely a century old, and you have a recipe for fear and distrust. The frown took on a worried look as he continued speaking. You won't try to go anywhere, I hope, while the council convenes? Protocol dictates that you remain here in the haven until we decide what we are going to mete out as your punishment. Don't worry, I'll stay put. Right here in this library of yours. Seike managed to smile. Good. That was all the elder said. He seemed as if he wanted to say more, but after a moment's hesitation, he merely murmured that he must leave to inform certain members of the nobility of the council meeting. Only the nobles were allowed to attend council without being on the council, and only then upon invitation by someone from the council. Elder Kessel departed, leaving Seike alone with his thoughts. He looked at the grandfather clock located at the end of the chamber. 9:05. They would be convening at 10 p.m. He wondered what Jack and Ferg were up to. It was a Friday night, so they were probably at the Old Doll, their favorite pub in downtown Iowa City. Probably just getting started for the night. Couldn't call them because cell phones and other technology were not permitted within the Haven. Technology could be tracked. Seike kept a small bachelor pad in Iowa City that was sparsely adorned with furniture and things such as a cell phone and laptop. He even kept some food there and not just blood bags. Although he didn't get any real sustenance from human food, he could still eat the stuff. It didn't hurt him. And so he sometimes would eat something just for the flavor. He was far from the only vampire that did that. What the elder had said just before they were intruded upon by Jirai and Farana stuck in his head. He was ready for anything, but now he had a hope for a lighter punishment. Something that wouldn't take up too much of his time. Perhaps he would even be able to drop by the pub later. He sat down at one of the 4 desks that this chamber of the library had arranged about it. He picked up a book that was lying within arm's reach on the desk and read the cover. Legends of the Old Gods was written on it, in English. He thumbed through the book a bit. Old English. There was no year or author stated anywhere that he could see, but it looked like a very old book. Well preserved, but very old. Probably at least a few centuries. He noticed a piece of folded paper between 2 of the pages. Then he noticed the heading at the top of the left page. The Purple God was written in an Old English flowing script, larger than the script of the page's actual content. Seike was perplexed. He read the first few paragraphs. A god that was robed in purple and smelled of lavender, but nothing about purple eyes. He, or it, was called the Purple God because apparently he had declined to ever give a name, so the ones who identified him simply named him after the color of his clothing. Bullshit, just like all the stuff on the old gods as far as Seike was concerned. But why the page marker? It could have been Kessel, but it could have been just as easily anyone else in the Haven. Seike thought of the library as Kessel's home only because the old man spent so much time here, but in reality he had his own quarters within the Haven just like everyone else. The library was for all who lived in this place. Seike had his own quarters too, but he spent around half of his time at his apartment anyway, as he rather liked technology, and people that didn't look at him sideways. The other Ambrogae were curious about him, it seemed. Someone was anyway, as the page marker was a bit of paper that didn't feel like Kessel, though Seike couldn't say who it was. His psychometry wasn't the best. He particularly excelled in psionics. It was like he was made for combat. At that thought, he went to the shelves in pursuit of a book on psionics. He found one that he hadn't yet read after a short time in the P section. There weren't many left he hadn't read already. This one was titled The Philosophy of Psionic Energy. He remembered seeing it over the years, but it never really sounded all that interesting to him, as he had never considered himself much of a philosopher. Apparently a lot of people felt the same way, as he could tell by the book's condition that not very many people had perused it over the years. He began at the start of the book, reading the introduction first. It was by an author called Vladimir Black. He found himself rereading the first 2 pages, unable to keep his attention on the book as he kept looking up at the clock. Before finishing the 2nd page, he rested his head between his forearms and just lay like that, face down on the desk, listening to the ticking of the clock. He kept his head down even after the clock struck 10. This particular grandfather clock was silent other than the usual tick-tock of the pendulum. It didn't chime as was common for clocks of its kind. Someone had disabled the mechanism for that long ago. Before much longer, he felt someone enter the library. Moments after, he heard a throat clear. He didn't sense any fear, though. That was good. Of course, he didn't sense it from Farana either. Ambrogae learned to disguise their emotions well with time. He lifted his head to regard the clock first. 10:15. They convened for only 15 minutes to decide whatever fate they had in store for him. Probably a minute or two less than that. He then turned his head to see a youngish noble that he recognized but couldn't remember the name of. There were over 3,000 Ambrogae in this place, and he had never bothered to get to know most of them, though he knew the face of each and every one after spending the better part of 40 years here. "They're ready to receive you," the young noble said. "They asked me to tell you not to delay," and with that the man left as quietly as he had come. Seike got up from the desk and did a quick cat stretch before heading for the archway into the other chamber with the exit. Time to get this shit over with, he thought to himself.